In this episode, we talk about two neighboring nations redrawing their boundaries. We also talk about a cyclone that is about to make its landfall in Odisha. But first, we recount the tragic crash of an Indian Air Force aircraft which took place 56 years ago, and the remains are still being recovered. Hi, I am Niharika Nanda, and you are listening to Three Things, the Indian Express news show. The transport aircraft Antonov AN-12 crashed shortly after takeoff from Chandigarh. The accident resulted in the deaths of all 98 passengers on board, including 6 crew members and 92 soldiers. The aircraft crashed into a mountain in Spiti Valley, far off its intended flight path, and it was reportedly carrying approximately Rs 30 lakh in cash, destined for the government treasury in Leh. The crash site remained undiscovered for decades, contributing to the mystery surrounding this tragic event. In this segment, my colleague Ichha Sharma speaks to Indian Express's Aman Singh Chhina, who sheds light on the AN-12 and its last flight that has remained one of the most enduring mysteries in India's aviation history.
So Aman, to get a better understanding of the significance of this aircraft, could you give us an overview of what is an AN-12 aircraft?
Yes, this aircraft, which was missing since February 1968, was an AN-12 aircraft of the Indian Air Force, which was in service for almost 40 years. It entered the Indian Air Force's service in the early 1960s. It had been bought from the Soviet Union, the erstwhile Soviet Union. And it was a transport aircraft, which means that it could carry passengers as well as cargo. And it was being used to ferry passengers on that day when it got lost. So it was a medium-lift transport aircraft, which continued in service for quite some time in the Indian Air Force.
Right, so you mentioned that this aircraft went missing. So could you shed light on the events that led up to this disappearance?
So on that particular day, in the first week of February 1968, the Indian Air Force was conducting sorties from its Chandigarh airbase to Leh in Ladakh. Now what happens is that during the winters, Ladakh is cut off from the rest of the India because the passes are all snowed under and there are no road links, as a result of which supplies as well as troops who need to go there or have to come back from there on leave or for other reasons, they have to be sent there or brought from there in aircraft of the Indian Air Force. So on that particular day, this particular AN-12 was carrying roughly around 98 passengers, including the crew. This aircraft was tasked in the afternoon to fly to Leh, carrying these passengers to Leh. However, it could not land in Leh because of bad weather. It tried to land, it tried to, find a way through the clouds, but ultimately a pilot and the co-pilot realized that they could not get through because of the heavy clouds, and they decided to return to Chandigarh. It was when they were returning to Chandigarh and they were flying over the mountains near Spiti in Himachal Pradesh. It was then that the link with the aircraft was lost and it did not come and land in Chandigarh at the scheduled time. So thereafter, search parties were sent, aircraft were sent to look for it. But because the weather was so bad, no trace of the aircraft was found until finally, pieces of the wreckage and some other evidence was located several decades later.
Right, so you spoke of the wreckage not being discovered after the aircraft went missing. There were a lot of conspiracy theories that came along due to that. So could you elaborate on that?
So what we learned from the family members of the crew which had gone missing was that initially, there was a lot of confusion on what happened. Where could have the aircraft gone? It was flying in a perfectly good condition and there was no reason for it to have gotten lost because when it was over Leh, it was in bad weather, but rest of the time, it was supposed to be in good weather. So that is what was presumed at that time. And then there were various permutations and combinations which were used and rumor mills started flying that, maybe the aircraft had lost its way and had found itself in Pakistan where the crew and the passengers had been held captive. So you see, this was in 1968 and just 3 years earlier we had been to war with Pakistan in 1965. So there was this feeling of, animosity and there was a feeling that, maybe Pakistan is behind this. But these were all rumors and gradually, they died out. And it was presumed that it has crashed somewhere in the high mountains. But unfortunately, in those years, immediately after the crash, there were no signs of the wreckage or, anything which could lead the authorities to conclude that the aircraft had gone down in those high mountains.
Right. So as you mentioned, initially the search operations did not work out, and then now that the debris have been found, what was the process of the investigation in this case?
Well, it was around 1987 that the first clues were found, which again was by Mountaineering Institute based in Manali, where some mountaineers had gone on this particular glacier where the aircraft wreckage has been spotted. They found some clues of some parts lying there and some documentation, like I think they found some letter of Armed Forces Inland letter with the stamp date of 1968. And they brought it back, and I spoke to the then director of the institute. He said that, he had sent all these details to the army headquarters. The army must have tried to, look out for this aircraft. But perhaps the snow was so great. And, it's a glacier. And as we know that great snow accumulates on the glaciers. And it is only now that, of the past 2 decades or so, that because of the global warming, the snow has started melting faster than the usual rate. So then after 1987, it was in 2003 that another expedition found substantive pieces of wreckage. And not only that, they also came across the remains of one of the soldiers who was flying on that aircraft on that particular day in 1968. That Jawan was identified as one Pioneer Beli Ram, or he belonged to a place near Jammu. And the documents in his clothes were found to be quite intact because of the deep snow. Everything was in good shape. And then his skeletal remains were recovered from that glacier, sent back to his hometown, and they were cremated with full military honors. After that, off and on, expeditions have been going and trying to find out more bodies, more remains, more wreckage. And till now, almost 9 remains have been recovered and identified.
Right. So given this, where does the investigation progress stand right now?
So as of now, what recently happened was that another expedition had gone on that glacier and they came back with remains of 4 people. They were duly identified. Again, they had all the documents on them, and those documents were readable, and these remains were identified and then sent to their respective hometowns where they were cremated with full military honors. Now, the point is that it is now known that the aircraft crashed into a high mountain, and the wreckage of the plane is scattered around the base of that mountain, which includes a glacier. So as and when the snow melts and as the glacier moves, and the glacier moves at a very slow pace, more and more wreckage is gradually surfacing. And since this is a very thick snow which lies over there, it's almost as thick as concrete, it is very difficult to dig out the wreckage or the remains with bare hands. So all these expeditions which go out from the Himalayan Mountaineering Institute in Manali, they try their best to get as much as they can. So that is how things stand today, that gradually they are finding more remains and bringing them down.
So were there any military aviation protocols or policies that were brought in after this incident, and what did the Indian Air Force have to say?
Well, the Air Force held an inquiry into this particular accident, as it does after all accidents, but the details of the inquiry were not revealed to the general public. But from what we know is that, yes, there are procedures which are put into place in order to ensure that, such an incident does not happen again. But that does not mean that it will not happen, because technical error can take place or human error can take place at any time. And while you put in all the standard operating procedures in place, there are mistakes which might happen, or there would be matters which are out of the control of the flying crew which may precipitate and crash. So yes, there have been crashes which have taken place in that same area or around that same area while the aircraft were flying to Leh or coming back from Leh. At least 2 such crashes come to my mind. One was when aircraft crashed while landing at Leh. It was again an AN-12 aircraft and 78 people were killed in that. There was another crash where again a large number of people died, I think more than 40, when that aircraft was returning from Leh and it crashed into mountains near Himachal Pradesh. So measures are taken. The people are told, the flying crew are told about the dangers and how to avoid them. But still, flying inherently is dangerous, and military flying more so. So there are checks and balances in place, but unfortunately more accidents have taken place.
Right. So while this incident took place in 1968, there was another incident in 1986, and yet another happened in Chennai in 2016, and all of these involved a transport aircraft. So during your reportage, did you see some similarities or key differences?
The crash in the disappearance, one would say, the disappearance of the aircraft in 1986, and I'm saying disappearance because it has not been found till date, and the flight which disappeared while on its way from Chennai to Port Blair in Andaman. They were two different incidents, and the aircraft in both the cases was AN-32, which is a successor aircraft of AN-12 in the Indian Air Force. This is also of Soviet origin, and this was inducted into the Indian Air Force in around 1986 when that aircraft was lost. In fact, that particular aircraft was being brought from Ukraine, where the factory of AN-32 was at that point of time and maybe still is. And it was being brought to India, where it was supposed to come to the air base at Jamnagar in Gujarat. So there was one leg of the flight from Ukraine to UAE. The second leg was from UAE to Muscat in Oman. And the third leg was from Muscat to Jamnagar. So the aircraft landed in Muscat, it refueled, it took off, and in some time in the afternoon over the Indian Ocean, it was lost. There were 3 aircraft which were coming, which are these brand new aircraft which were being brought from the factory in Ukraine. 2 of them landed in Jamnagar, the third one did not. Till date, it is not known what happened, where it went, if it has crashed, which the presumption is that it has, why it has crashed, how it has crashed. There is no clue of anybody. There were, I think, 7 people or 9 people traveling in it, including 4 crew. They have all lost. So there is no word about them till date. The Air Force has held an inquiry, but again, the results of the inquiry have not come out. There has been some speculation that there was a mid-air collision with some US Navy aircraft because there was a US Navy aircraft carrier group which was operating near Oman at that point of time, near the area where the aircraft was lost. But that, again, is a conjecture. Nothing has come out of it, and the Air Force has certainly not said anything about it. The second aircraft, which you talk about, the 2016, it again went missing in 2016 while flying from Chennai to Port Blair. And for a long period of time, it was not known what happened to it. Again, it was presumed that it crashed into the sea in the Bay of Bengal. And many, many years later, the wreckage was located in the Andaman Sea. No recoveries of any remains have been made in this because it is lying at a great depth.
Also, during your reportage, you also spoke to the families of the passengers and crew of the aircraft. If you could speak about that.
Yes, I spoke to the son of the co-pilot of the aircraft. He is now based in USA, in Cincinnati. And he gave me quite a few details about what happened that day. His father, Coordinator Malhotra, had gone on that sortie in the afternoon, and he told me that his father was not initially slated to fly in this aircraft, because he had just come back from Leh in another sortie. And so therefore it was, he had completed that sortie and he was about to go home. However, when he was leaving, he was approached by another pilot who was supposed to fly in this very aircraft, and he said that his child is unwell and he wants to take care of him. So he asked Coordinator Malhotra if he could fill in for his place. So while his father was initially reluctant because he had already done his task for the day and he wanted to get home to his family, he had a wife and 2 young children. One was a 4-year-old boy to whom I spoke, and the other younger one was 1-year-old. So, but suddenly he says, something came upon my father that, his child is not well, so perhaps he needs more time. So he said, okay, you go, you take care of your child. I'll go again in the sortie. So he, by chance of fate, he was not supposed to fly in this aircraft, but he ended up being a co-pilot in this aircraft and he never came back. So that was a very tragic incident which took place. And basically what the son was saying was that they need some sort of a closure to take place. They know now that the aircraft crashed over there. So if there was any way that, the Air Force could take them over there in helicopters or something, so, if, they could shower some flowers over there or pay homage to all those people who died in that crash, including his father, he said that would be great.
Next, we talk about the redrawing of borders between 2 nations. Neighboring countries, Switzerland and Italy, are on their way to redraw their border. The 2 countries share a common natural border created by the glaciers and snow-capped peaks. But unlike similar situations elsewhere which stem from border conflicts, territory issues, or wars, this one is caused by climate change. To understand in depth the reason behind the redrawing of the border and the gravity of the climate change situation in Europe, we have Indian Express's Dipanita Nath joining us. Dipanita, can you tell us what is the current established border between Italy and Switzerland?
See, the border between Italy and Switzerland runs through some very iconic natural landmarks, particularly the Alps. So now large sections of this border involves glaciers. The Swiss government said in a statement that the border stretches through the watershed or ridge lines of glaciers, fern or perpetual snow. Now, fern is actually, it's old compacted snow that has melted and refrozen but hasn't become a solid glacier yet. So you see that a lot of this border is it's passing through glaciers. In fact, the border that is being changed is beneath the Matterhorn. And this is one of Europe's highest peaks and very popular with skiers and alpine mountaineers. And so Switzerland and Italy have agreed to change along these landmarks. The landmarks along which they will be changed is Plateau Rosa, the Carol Refuge, and Gobba di Rollen. So this is where the Zama region of Switzerland meets the Aosta Valley of Italy. And this is also the region that is very popular because they have lots of prominent ski resorts that feed the economies of both countries.
Right. And you mentioned that the border will be changed. So what is the reason behind that? And tell us about the commission that has been set up by the two countries and what are its recommendations?
So in 2023, that's last year, Italy and Switzerland set up a commission to actually study the impact of climate change on the glaciers and how it was affecting the borders. So it is this commission that in May last year, they recommended that new borders be redrawn. And on September 27th, Switzerland signed the agreement for the new border.
And Dipanita, can you tell us about the climate change that is happening in Europe and how it is affecting the continent?
Europe is the fastest warming continent in the world. And the climate risks are impacting its energy, its food security, ecosystems, infrastructure, water resources, economic stability, and public health. Now, the thing is that it's not going to get better according to the predictions. In fact, the European Environment Agency said that extreme heat, drought, wildfires, and flooding are going to worsen even in Europe, even under optimistic global warming situations. And this will affect living conditions throughout the continent. This modification of the border between Italy and Switzerland has actually directed renewed attention to the impact of climate change on glaciers worldwide, actually.
Right. And you also had the opportunity of having a word with an expert from Zurich. So what did he have to say? Also, what did the report of the Swiss Commission for Cryosphere Observation of the Swiss Academy of Sciences have to say about this entire climate change situation in Europe?
I contacted Dr. Matthias Haas. He's the director of a glacier monitoring organization, GLAMOS, and he's a lecturer at the Department of Civil Environment and Geomatic Engineering in Zurich. And he said that there have been several record melt events in a row in the last decades and years. So glaciers have lost an incredible amount of ice in just the 21st century. And many large glacier tongues are decaying and small glaciers are disappearing. Now, the time that I was contacting him was also when the Swiss Commission for Cryosphere Observation of the Swiss Academy of Sciences, they had released a report, and the report said as much. It showed that in 2024 itself, Swiss glaciers recorded melting at a striking degree and with the greatest loss of ice since measurements began happening. And in fact, Dr. Haas said that other countries globally might also have to rethink their natural landmarks soon. And he said that the problem concerns all mountain ranges worldwide. So the landscape in the summit region changes, which has an impact on the appearance of mountains, its symbolic significance, and natural hazards such as floods and avalanches.
So are there any measures that are being taken in order to improve the situation?
We have become far more aware about climate change. Also, the effects of climate change are being felt by each one of us. Since we are talking about Europe and everywhere else, governments have become very proactive. So what is happening, at least in Europe in this context, is that the plans to fight climate change have become very concrete over the last years, and political discussion is active. So Dr. Haas told me that at least politically they were on the right track. However, the speed of implementation of actual measures was still very slow. Under the Paris Agreement, countries have agreed to keep the long-term global average surface temperature well below 2 degrees C above pre-industrial levels, and ideally to 1.5 degrees C by the end of this century. but we are currently at 1.1 degrees C above pre-industrial levels. And you can see the effect in the form of droughts, wildfires, unseasonal rain, and so many other natural calamities that have actually affected thousands and thousands of lives.
Dipanita, you mentioned the Paris Agreement. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
So the Paris Agreement is actually a legally binding international treaty on climate change. It was adopted by 196 parties at the UN Climate Change Conference, which was COP21 in Paris. That happened in 2015. And its goal was to limit the increase in the global average temperature to well below 2 degrees C above pre-industrial level, and ideally to limit the temperature increase to 1.5 degree above pre-industrial level.
Right. And Dipanita, would you say that India is also facing a similar challenge?
Yes, India is actually facing very deep impacts of climate change. For this particular story, of course, I spoke to Dr. Arun Bhakta Shrestha, who's a senior climate change specialist and strategic group lead for reducing climate and environmental risk at ICIMOD. And so we spoke about closer home to the Hindu Kush Himalaya region, which is also experiencing unprecedented glacier melt due to rising global temperatures. Now, this poses severe threats to water security, livelihoods, and ecosystems. So there have been records which showed that glacier mass loss increased by around 65% in the 2010s compared to the previous decades. And projections suggest that even if global warming is limited to 1.5 degrees, the Hindu Kush Himalaya region could lose up to 36% of its glacier volume by 2100. And with a 2-degree rise, this could increase to 50%. So this accelerated retreat not only increases the risk of glacial lake outburst floods, but also threatens critical water flow, which will have more impact in upstream parts of the river basins and in more meltwater dependent river basins such as the Indus. So, once again, the prognosis does not look very bright for us.
And in the end, we talk about Cyclone Dana. A severe cyclonic storm is about to make its landfall in Odisha. Cyclone Dana has already formed over East Central Bay of Bengal and is expected to make its landfall between Bhitarkanika and Dhamra areas of the state with a predicted wind speed of 100 to 120 kmph on the night of October 24, Indian Meteorological Department officials have said. Indian Express's Sujit Bisoi reported that IMD Director General Mrityunjay Mohapatra said that maximum wind speed will be felt in the districts of Jagat Singhpur, Kendrapada, Bhadrak and Balasore of Odisha and East Mednipur of West Bengal. The cyclone is also predicted to trigger very heavy rainfall in coastal and northern parts of Odisha, and a total of 14 districts are expected to be affected. Uma Shankar Das, a scientist at the Bhubaneswar Regional Centre, said, and I quote, "There are chances of storm surge above the astronomical tide, resulting in inundation of low-lying areas in Kendrapada, Bhadrak and Balasore districts during the landfall." IMD sources said that the cyclone may cause major damage to thatched houses and huts, rooftops may blow away, and power and communication lines are likely to be disrupted. It could also uproot trees and affect the standing crops in some areas, wrote Sujit. The state has started implementing precautions. It has put the government machinery on high alert and started shifting people from vulnerable areas to designated shelters prepared by the administration. Sujit reported that the state's Revenue and Disaster Management Minister Suresh Pawar said that around 5,000 shelters and relief centers have been prepared by the administration. The government has planned to evacuate over 10 lakh people from low-lying areas and vulnerable places. To assist local administration, the government has deployed over 20 teams of Odisha Disaster Rapid Action Force as well as several fire service personnel. While 20 NDRF teams have already been deployed, 5 more have been airdropped from Bhatinda in Punjab. You were listening to 3 Things by the Indian Express. Today's episode was edited and mixed by Suresh Pawar and produced by Ichha Sharma and me, Niharika Nanda. If you like the show, then do subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts. You can also recommend the show to someone you think will like it. Share it with a friend or someone in your family. It's the best way for people to get to know about us. You can also tweet us at Express Podcast and write to us at podcasts@indianexpress.com.